back. We had to reschedule, and I'm so glad that he agreed to reschedule. He's not just a speaker today, but he's been a constant source of support from the day we've been planning this workshop, and he's been helping us with a lot of suggestions as well. I'm so glad to have you back here, sir, Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan. Yes. The moderator for today is Lijin. He is a PhD scholar of the department. He is working on reimagining and transfiguring landscapes, farms, fields, and forests of colonial Malabar. Over to you, Lijin, for the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, everyone, and warm welcome to the 10th session of the online international workshop organized by the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, supported by Kerala Council for Historical Research. A running theme of this webinar is Sensing the Past, Thematic Departures and Archival Search. Before we begin, here are few instructions to be noted. Request to all, mute your mic and turn off your video until the session is over. Registered participants, mark your attendance in the Google form. The link will be provided in the chat box shortly. You can also type your queries into the chat box during or at the end of the lecture. I will bring them up once the presentation is over. Let's begin the session. Today, our speaker is Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan, eminent environmental historian and professor of History and Environmental Studies at Ashoka University, Delhi. He is talking on nature's past, ecology, identity, and history in South Asia. Without any delay, I invite Ms. Radhika, postgraduate student, Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, to introduce the speaker and welcome the gathering.
Thank you. Good evening to all. Welcome to the 10th lecture, Nature's Past, Ecology, Identity and History in South Asia, of the lecture ongoing international webinar on Sensing the Past, hosted by the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, with the financial assistance of Kerala Council for Historical Research. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome the distinguished speaker, Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan, for the day, who is here to deliver the talk. He teaches history and environmental studies at Ashoka University. He studied at the universities of Delhi and Oxford. He has been director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in 2011 to 2015, and also chaired the Elephant Task Force of the Government of India in 2010. His first book, Pens in the Forest, was published in 1996, and the latest work, Nature and Nation, in 2015. His co-edited works include Nature Without Borders, Shifting Ground in 2014, and At Nature's Edge 2018. We are so grateful to Mahesh Rangarajan sir for accepting our invitation. Welcome sir, and also a warm welcome to all the participants to the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. I invite Professor Mahesh Rangarajan to make his presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. It's a great privilege to be with you today. It is unfortunate because of the COVID that I'm unable to be in your very beautiful campus, and I'm speaking from the concrete jungle of New Delhi. The subject I suggested, Nature's Past, the relationship between identity, ecology, and history, would be of widespread interest because we're living in a time of epochal changes. You may have recently seen the release in India by no less than the Prime Minister of a report on the status of the tiger, its habitat, and its prey. This report was released earlier this year in 2020, and it tried to give an idea of the status of the populations of this very large big cat. And it argued, according to the information gathered by the National Tiger Conservation Authority, with the assistance of teams who had fanned out over the 320,000 square kilometers where they hoped to find presence of the tiger, the numbers of the tiger were substantially more than 15 years ago. There's been much debate on how accurate these figures are, on whether the 50 tiger reserves, the first of which were created in 1973, just under 50 years ago, have succeeded or not. It was evident that of the various states that still have tigers within them, there are many Asian states that have tigers. Last count was 13. In 6 of them, this animal has the status of a national animal. In class, I like to ask my students a question. Suppose a tiger goes from Nepal to India, or from India to Bangladesh, or crosses from Burma to India, because these are all nation states which have habitats in which tigers can crisscross these human-made borders. Does the nationality of the tiger change? So does the Indian tiger become a Bangladeshi tiger? Or does the Indian tiger become a Nepalese tiger? Or does the Burmese tiger become an Indian tiger? At one level, this is a somewhat frivolous question. And it sort of reminds us that the planet, its animals, its birds, its plants, do not recognize the human-made borders. We may think of political, administrative borders, but there are other kinds of borders. There are also borders of culture and identity. It's interesting that at the very beginning of the report, there was a quotation which will be much more familiar to the faculty, the students, the very distinguished members of the Sanskrit University. A person like me is ignorant. I have to read it in another language, in English. But to paraphrase, this is a quote from what Sanjaya, who was the close confidant of the Kuru king Dhritarashtra, said to him. He said that the tigers guard the forest and the forest guards the tiger. If the tiger perishes, so does the forest. If the forest perishes, so does the tiger. This quotation in Roman script, in Sanskrit, with the English translation, is at the very outset of that report. And it is perfectly understandable that this is seen as an early invocation of a consciousness of ecology. The relationship of the tiger with the monsoon forest has been so significant for us over the last 50 odd years. It's only in 1969 that there came to be a serious concern about the possible extinction or the endangerment of the Bengal tiger. Its classification was changed in November 69 in a very important meeting held in Delhi of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. The tiger was listed in the Red Book. Little later, in September 1970, a moratorium was declared on the export of tiger skins, and a ban was also placed for 5 years on tiger hunting. 2 years later, there was a report, and in 1973, the world's then largest wildlife conservation program was launched to save the tiger. Speaking at its launch, the then Prime Minister, at that time, that is the first time the Prime Minister of India spoke on the tiger. Since then, there have been many Prime Ministers, but various heads of government have given conservation of nature significance. But that speech is important because of what she said. She said Project Tiger abounds in irony. The country that has been famous through the ages for this magnificent beast is now engaged in a struggle to secure it from extinction. Through this one statement, 2 things happen. First, India, the resources and energy of India, the state, the people, the country, are placed at the service of a larger cause, not just saving the tiger or protecting individual tigers, but trying to protect the tiger in the context of its larger environment, its grassland, marsh, forest, or scrub jungle home, along with the many birds, beasts, reptiles, and creatures that live in it. Around this time, as Paul Greeno, very important professor and scholar, reminds us, the government documents stopped referring to the tiger as the Bengal tiger and began to refer to it as the Indian tiger. In September 1972, a further change took place. The lion, which had been the national animal since 1969, was replaced by the tiger. When asked why this was so, the chairman of the Indian Board for Wildlife, Dr. Karan Singh, after first had to deny the rumor that this was because his own nickname was Tiger. Having set this aside, he explained that the lion was found now in only one Indian state. It had been wiped out across northwest and central India. And this one state was Gujarat. It continued to be one of the very important animals in the national emblem of India. National emblem of India, as you recall, 1950, was the lion capital of Ashoka, the great 3rd century BC emperor, after whom my own very young 6-year-old university is named. The lion capital of Ashoka has 4 lions. Each of them has what is known as the Flemen expression. I'd love to do it, but it will look extremely rude. The lion is sticking its tongue out at you. And this was therefore an animal of Mauryan royalty, in fact, of Mauryan empire. And over the centuries, the lion had become and was to be, as we shall see, a very important symbol of royal, indeed, of imperial power. From early centuries of the Common Era, the reference to the throne is of the Simhasana, the seat of the lion. In Sanskrit, there is a very interesting term used for the ascending of the throne by the one who sits on it. It is known as Simha Vilokana, that is the lion getting onto a promontory or a higher space of land and looking all around. So the gaze of the lion at its dominion is compared to the way the king views his or her subjects or the realm. Now in 1972, there was a second reason, according to Dr. Karan Singh, that the tiger replaced the lion. He pointed out that the tiger was found in 11 of the then 16 states of the Union. And therefore, the tiger would not only be a symbol of total environmental preservation in these newly designated tiger reserves, but it would be, he said, a symbol of unity in diversity. Wherever the tiger roamed, whichever state it was in, whichever reserve it was in, whichever of the 11 states it was in, it would be a symbol of India. In a sense, I think, this association of nature with the nation, or if you like, of the nation state with a very important facet of nature, in this case an animal, is a very interesting instance of drawing on the landscape or the waterscape in order to inculcate or further spread a deeper sense of affiliation, in this case to the idea of the Indian nation. As you will all doubtless recall, early 1972 saw the birth of a new nation state in South Asia, Bangladesh. And Bangladesh's first Prime Minister, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, did not lose much time in designating the tiger as the national animal of Bangladesh. So I think there's a very interesting question of why there is such an association of identity, in this case, the Indian national identity, with this particular animal, the tiger. Of course, this is by no means unique. We are living through a very important election in the most powerful nation on earth, the United States of America. In the 3rd week of January, there will be a new president. Whoever gets elected, it will be a new president. And that president will, the seal of presidential authority will have a very prominent bird, the bald eagle, which is a unique bird found only in North America, that is in the United States and Canada. In the late 18th century, when the bald eagle was chosen as a symbol, Benjamin Franklin, the great inventor, objected to it. The eagle, he admitted, was a magnificent bird, but he said it lacks character. It doesn't even hunt. It's a pirate of the air. It is hardly a symbol of a newborn republic. He instead suggested a somewhat less prepossessing bird, the turkey, which of course is uniquely American. The turkey is of course important American culture, but not to look at, but to eat. Thanksgiving, which incidentally is going on right now, normally the family sits down to a dinner of turkey. India is of course somewhat different from the United States. When we take animals such as the tiger and the lion, just to give instances, these have a very deep resonance in different cultures, literatures, in epic, in ballad, in poem, and in verse. One could go back in time. In a remarkable recent book, Mega Mammals in Ancient India, originally a doctoral thesis at the University of Delhi, Dr. Shibani Bose has done fascinating research on the importance of tiger symbolism in the Harappan civilization. It is very much there, and she shows how the glittering eyes of the tiger are very important in some of the figurines of Harappa. But there is much more material if one begins to look at early inscriptions and writings. I referred to the Mahabharata. One could refer to both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and I'm referring to the very interesting commentaries and translations, the Valmiki version. There are, of course, many versions. Each and all of them are significant. But to go back, it's fascinating to note how the reference to the brothers Rama, Lakshmana. When they go into the forest, they are referred to as Vyagra Purusha. Vyagra meaning, of course, the tiger. Purusha meaning men. So they are tigers among men. In a very moving scene, which all of you will doubtless recall, and there are different versions. In the Kamba Ramayana, Ravana does not pick up Sita, he picks up the ground on which she stands because he cannot lay his hands upon her. He behaves in a somewhat different manner from the Ravana of Valmiki. In the Valmiki Ramayana, when he attempts to approach her, she warns him, and I quote, that you do not know who my husband is. He is a lion-like man. He's a man among lions, and he's a lion among men. So there is a very interesting association of the lion here with courage, with bravery, with enormous strength, and needless to say, with royalty. This association, of course, has other implications. It's fascinating to see that in the Mahabharata, the different warriors evoke different descriptions. One of them, who's of course very important and beloved even now of children, because children like to enact these epics, is Bhima. Now, Bhima has a very interesting appellation. He is known as Rikodara, which means the one with the belly of a wolf, referring, of course, to an enormous appetite. But Bhima's locks, that is his hair, is compared to the mane of a lion. Bhima is supposed to have a distinctive roar, which evokes the roar of the lion. And Bhima on the battlefield is important because with his mace or the gadda, he kills enormous numbers of elephants. And the havoc that he wreaks on the elephants is compared to the havoc wreaked by a lion in the forest when he hunts down an enormous elephant to remove from its forehead the gajamukha or the elephant ball. There is no uh, evidential value to this, that lions hunt elephants and take away the gajamukha. It should perhaps be seen in allegorical or metaphorical terms. What I want to emphasize is that through history, because there are certain animals that evoke fear or that are admired for their majesty and yet evoke deep fears in all people, in king and commoner alike, these animals have come to be symbols of much more than just themselves. There's a very interesting account. There are many accounts, and not all are historically reliable. Many date from more than a century after his death, of a very important figure, widely known across Asia, the Buddha. The Buddha is referred to as the Shakta Simha, or the lion among the Shaktas. His first famous sermon in the deer park of Sarnath. Note, here among the deer, he preaches a message of peace, a new message of the path to enlightenment. And it is likened in Pali writings to the Simha Nada, that is the roar of the lion. So just as the ground shakes when a lion roars, the minds and hearts of women and men were moved by the preaching of the Buddha. It's natural that we would be very fascinated by these large beasts which are larger than us. One reason is that we live at a time when there are so few of them. It's been pointed out by scholars like Dr. Ullas Karand that the tiger, which once had a vast range across Asia, from Turkey in the west, through Iran, Anatolia, through modern-day Pakistan and India, into Nepal, northward into China, through Southeast Asia, and ending up in the Amur Manchurian reaches. Today, it is found in barely 7% of its former range. The lion, of course, is restricted to one large patch of land in the Gir forest and its surrounds in Gujarat. The vast territory of the lion, if you include all the places that a lion walks past with its paws, is barely 20,000 square kilometers in a 3 million square kilometer country. The tiger, as I said, is probably there in 10% of India, but the reserves where its future is supposed to be secure are less than 100,000 square kilometers. Think of another very important animal. In her fascinating work on political violence in early India and her other extensive corpus of work, my distinguished senior colleague, Professor Upinder Singh, points out that royalty in ancient India was not necessarily associated with the lion. It was associated with two other very fascinating animals, the bull and the elephant. The elephant has been so significant in Asian cultures since it was first tamed and trained, not domesticated, about 2,300 or 2,600 years ago. So for 2.5 millennia, elephants have been very significant, not just as animals that were captured and tamed, but as part of a war machine. Thomas Trautmann, the great scholar of Sanskrit as well as Tamil, has marvelous work, Elephants and Kings, where he argues that kingship in South Asia was reinvented between the 6th and 3rd centuries BC. And this particular model was then adapted to various parts of West and Southeast Asia, though never in China, where the power of the monarch depended on the ability to harness these enormous animals of the forest. The trapping of these animals was entrusted often to forest peoples, who of course were in a subordinate relationship to the sovereign, because they paid tribute, believe it or not, in the form of live elephants. The forests where these elephants were often secured by decree. The Arthashastra, there is much debate on its dating. Due to Oliville's work, we can somewhat reliably date it. The Arthashastra, as we see it, is a somewhat later work, but its roots lie in the early centuries BC. And the Arthashastra refers to 9 Gajamanas or Hastamanas. Interestingly, there are none listed in southern India, where the great populations of the animals still reside. But these vanas are protected by royal decree. The length of the road, or rather the breadth of the road, is specified. There are very strict penalties, including that of death, Mrityudanda, Dandaniti, for the killing or the poaching of elephants. So there is a relationship of the forest people, the king, the forest, and the elephant. The same ruler also had to protect crops from the elephants. And the Arthashastra, of course, describes an ideal, not a real state. It's a normative model. And it argues that these elephant forests should be around the rim of the territory of the empire, rather than at its center. It has been argued, and I think it's significant, that the utility of elephants, their importance as war machines, helped secure their survival in much of South and Southeast Asia, which was not the case in China, where, with one exception in the 18th century, elephants were not used for warfare. In his remarkable work on China, a history of the last 4,000 years, Mark Elvin argues that the advance of Han Chinese civilization and rice cultures was inversely proportional to the presence of the elephants. Much of what is now modern China had elephants. They were never in as large numbers as in India, but they had a very extensive range. That range was to shrink, not only because of the spread of agriculture, after all that was to happen and has happened in South and Southeast Asia, but also because of the absence of royal protection. To this, one may add, it is not merely a question of royal protection, it's also a question of cultures of perception. The elephant in South and Southeast Asian cultures, has not been perceived for centuries simply as another animal. Today, there is a lot of writing by literary scholars on the notion of affect. It could be argued that the notion of affect was applied to denizens of the animal world very early on, and one of the few wild animals to which it was regularly applied was the elephant. Think back to something all of you would be familiar with. One of the very moving instances in the Ramayana, where Bharata goes into the forest to meet his elder brother, and he tells Rama of the death of Dasharatha. And Rama is supposed to have fainted. He was not able to cope with the grief at the news of the death of his father, whom he not only respected, but he was very attached to. And the grief of Rama, the sorrow, is compared in many versions to the grief of the mother elephant at the death of a calf. It's a very interesting inversion. It's the parent who's dying, and the son who has died, and the son who is grieving. But it shows us the significance of both the father to the son and the son to the father by showing a metaphor of the mother elephant grieving. There are much more fascinating accounts of the elephants of the forest, the great tuskers which race out from the mountains when they hear the sound of thunder, because the tusker believes, the great elephant believes, that this is another elephant come to do battle with it. The great elephants of the mountains are compared to great rocks on the mountains or to great clouds in the sky. And the clouds in turn are compared to the enormous elephants that roam in the forest. So these developments of different kinds of relationships come about because the elephant is not only a military animal and a ceremonial animal, one that becomes important in rituals, but is also one that is seen as possessed of personality. I would point out that right into the 19th and early 20th century, the landed gentry and aristocracy in many parts of India not only kept elephants, but the it was a custom in some families, certainly in Eastern India. I refer to Chittagong by mention, where when a male son was born in a zamindar's house, they also got a baby elephant, and this future heir of the landed estate and the elephant grew up together. So these associations are very significant. There's a very interesting couplet which is well known to scholars of medieval and early modern history, where Akbar, on the conquest of the sultanates of the south, took away an elephant. There's supposed to be two elephants, and there's supposed to be a couple. And Akbar took away one elephant. And the sorrow of the elephant Chanchal, when deprived of her consort, became a very important trope in poetry. Now, we do not know if the elephant really grieved, but it's interesting that the grief of this elephant for its beloved is somewhat akin to that of two humans who are in love and are parted, in this case, because of the acquisition of one of the two partners as booty in warfare. So I think that there are different kinds and grades of relationships, and the notions of identity also build in these relationships. The idea that India is a land of the tiger, that the survival of the tiger is important to the Indian nation state, that the tiger, as the first director of Project Tiger said, he called the tiger the spirit of the Indian jungle. The tiger, he said, is an index of environmental quality. The existence of tigers in these forests meant that the health of the forest was being maintained. Around the same time, the lion came to acquire similar significance in the Indian state of Gujarat in 1972, just as the lion lost its throne at the national level. It was declared the state animal of Gujarat. And more than a year before the launch of Project Tiger, there was a Project Lion in an effort to protect the lion and its habitat. But let me go back in time. It's very fascinating work written in the 90s by Zimmerman, originally in French and then translated, which one can return to with great profit. Zimmerman draws on a lot of the Sanskrit pharmacopoeias, Charaka, Samhita, and others. He refers to the Atharva Ved and the Manusmriti, works written or rather composed at different points of time in history. But one of the underlying themes of these books is the significance of another very important animal in terms of identity. For those who composed these texts, I use the word composed because the writing of many of these texts was to take place much later. They were handed over in oral form from one person who was capable of recitation to the next. And in these recitations, the animal that stands out is the Krishna Mriga, or the black buck. The land where the black antelope roamed was seen as the center of the land of the Brahminical sacrifice. So important was the black buck that in some of the writings it is that Aryavarta only extends to where the black antelope roams. This, in a sense, has to be taken very carefully and examined because these are metaphorical ideas, not literal ones. Anyone who has familiarity with India's ecology would know that it's a vast country with a very varied and diverse ecology. The black antelope, of course, is there. It was there until recently in large numbers in northwestern, northern, and central India. But it has a very extensive range, going south of the Vindhyas, deep into the peninsula. The southernmost population of the Antilopa cervicapra, or the black buck as it is called, is in Tirunelveli district in the deep south of Tamil Nadu. But this is an animal whose habitat, or rather preferred range, is more important than its actual spread. The land of the black antelope is also described as Jangala. And Zimmerman reminds us that Jangala refers to dry land that can bear cereals. The Jangala was a land where it was possible to roam and not fall ill with shivers, probably malaria. And it is contrasted to another kind of landscape, the Anupa, the land of the marshes, the land of wild elephants, the land of geese. So there are two kinds of contrast. The Aryavarta is different from the lands which have not been Aryanized. And so there are other peoples, other cultures beyond this land. The Arya is symbolized by the skin, which in Tamil is known as the mantol, the hide of the antelope. Today, if you were to see the Brahminical sacrifices, the mantol which is used is of the cheetal or the spotted deer. But traditionally and for centuries, it was the black antelope. And this goes back a very long time. When Rama and Lakshmana go into the forest, Rama instructs Lakshmana to do a sacrificial offering in order to set up the ashrama or the hermitage, and asks him to not only find the Krishna Mriga, but make sure that it is one which is black, and where the black is very, it's a jet black. And tradition has it that the most grand black antelope is all black. This probably doesn't exist, but it's a metaphor. When Arjuna wins the hand of Draupadi in the Swayamvara, in the court of King Drupada, he was dressed, of course, he was there in what we would today call mufti. He went pretending to be a Brahmana. And when he goes up and he wins the hand, the Brahmanas, because one of them had won the hand of the princess, it is said took away their antelope hides and waved them. So I think the black antelope here becomes a metaphor. It becomes a symbol of both a particular kind of culture and a particular kind of landscape. And the opposite of the black antelope is another kind of landscape. It's a landscape of reeds, of marshes, where travel is much more difficult. So there is a contrast here, if you like, between arid and monsoon India, or a landscape which is semi-arid and drier, which would have had vast herds of blackbuck till well into the 20th century, and other lands which are better watered and where the nature of the vegetation allows for a somewhat different complex of fauna as well as flora. So what I'm trying to argue is that the notions of identity not only matter at the level of state building and royalty, of empire and epic, they also matter in the levels of pharmacopoeias, in different kinds of lore and literature. This is, of course, not specific only to one particular period. I think we will find similar instances across different times in history. One of the very interesting persons to come into India and to establish a principality, or rather the seeds of what would become later a much larger empire long after his death, was Babur. And we're all familiar with the events of the Battle of Panipat 1526. But to me, Babur is much more interesting as a raconteur than as a conqueror. And because he spent so much of his time on horseback, moving as a roving disinherited prince, trying to found a principality, he tended to keep a regular record of his activities, not only as he marked names, dates, times, and places. He also refers to animals, birds, beasts, plants, the landscape around him. Teaching the Babarnama in class is always fascinating. There's always a student, a very bright one, who asks, did Babur actually write all this himself, or did his nobles write it for him? And you're constrained to remark that Babur spent his time on horseback, sort of traveling soldier of fortune, going from place A to place B, trying his luck until he finally broke through in Panipat. But to me, what is interesting is that when Babur crosses the river Indus, which was earlier known as the Sindhu, he is conscious that he's entered a different kind of zone. He writes very movingly that when you cross the Indus, you're in a completely different land. The taste of the water is different. The plants are different. The animals are different. The people are different. That's roughly the order in which he says it. Some of the animals he describes in a sense with a great sense of wonder. Inevitably, and I'm sure we all have our favorites, mine would be the elephant. He marvels at the elephant, at the dexterity of its trunk, its enormous intelligence, at the fact that it is used in battle. But the animal which he also writes about, which he encounters for the first time, incidentally, and it might interest you, near Peshawar, is the rhinoceros. The great one-horned rhinoceros was hunted by Babur along with his Umrah in the jungles near the Indus. This was a very difficult animal to hunt. And Babur describes how arrows and spears bounced off its hide until one of his Umrah discovered that the belly of the rhinoceros was very soft. So he pierced the rhinoceros with the belly, and he was renamed Ganda Khan, or the Khan of the rhinos. And Babur's account of the rhinoceros is fascinating because he says that this animal has the strength of an ox, but it can run as fast as a horse. Now, the rhinoceros, of course, had a vast range at the time Babur was 500 years ago. We know from the works of Shumit Guha that the population of India was probably between 110 and 115 million. And the density, therefore, for those who want to think in number terms, was probably around 35 to a square kilometer. The density today, there is no census of 21, but if we extrapolate from the 2011 census, 2011 was 354 per square kilometer. So you're talking of a subcontinent where the density of human population was 1/10 of what it is today. So also talking of a subcontinent, where the area under the plow, and there are differing estimates, I'm taking only one of them, could have been as low as 25% of the landscape. So this is a landscape of vast grasslands dotted with trees in many parts of north, central, western, and even southern India. It's a tree-covered savanna, which we miss out because, as has been argued in a recent paper by the very deeply perceptive ecologist Jayashree Ratnam, now at the National Center for Biological Sciences, the foresters of the late 19th and the late 20th century missed out on these trees because they went around looking for timber. So many of the areas they classified as scrub jungle or poor thorn forest would perhaps be better classified as grassland or savanna of a very particular kind. The rhino, of course, would shrink enormously in range. By the late 19th century, it was vanishing in areas such as Pilibhit, UP, where it had been famous. And by the 1900s, it was found only in parts of Nepal, West Bengal, Bhutan, and needless to say, the Brahmaputra Valley or Assam, its major stronghold. I referred to 1972 and the consecration, if you like, or enthronement, if you like, or redesignation, if you like, of the tiger as the national animal, as the Indian tiger. Well, that year they passed a new law, the first federal law on wildlife in independent India, the Wildlife Protection Act. The Wildlife Protection Act had a Schedule 1. These were species which were not to be hunted, captured, killed in any conditions. One of them was the great Indian one-horned rhinoceros. This animal is no more referred to by this name because around the same time, Nepal made a switch, whereas the kings earlier had hunted huge amounts of rhinoceros. One king in the 1930s on one expedition shot as many as 30 rhinos, and in his lifetime is supposed to have killed over 500 rhinos. In 1972, Nepal declared the Chitwan as a national park, named it after King Mahendra, and Nepal, like India, set about to protecting its wildlife, in this case, not just the tiger, but also the rhino. So the Nepalese objected to the rhino being called the Indian rhino, and therefore, after a lot of debate, and because there's another form of one-horned rhino in Asia, it was renamed the Greater One-Horned Rhinoceros. This news did not reach one place, a very important state in the Indian Union, namely Assam. And in Assam, the rhinoceros became a symbol in 1979-80 of a very important organization in the politics of Assam, the Assam Gano Parishad. The All Assam Students Union, which later gave birth to the Assam Gano Parishad, the political party, in 1985. Interestingly, ASU was supposed to be a movement to detect the aliens who were supposed to have come across the border and threatened to reduce the Assamese speakers into a linguistic minority. Assam went through a lot of political turmoil, and it was put under a period of federal rule. In the early 80s, there was concern that most of the rhinoceroses were concentrated in a few national parks and sanctuaries in Assam, and there was a proposal to move a few of the rhinos from Assam to a part of their former range in the Tarai, the grasslands at the foot of the Himalayas in Uttar Pradesh, to a park called Dudhwa. This led to very powerful opposition in Assam. There were enormous protests. The students' movement declared that no rhino would leave the sacred soil of Assam because the rhino was Assamese. But when did the rhino become Assamese? When does an animal become a symbol of aspirations of a people? When does it become symbol of aspiration that is exclusive? Namely, not only are rhinos Assamese, but Assam would be incomplete without the rhinos. The rhinos would not feel at home outside Assam. The rhinos are so important to Assam that not even one of them will be permitted to leave its borders. There's very interesting work by Professor Arup Jyoti Saikia, who teaches at IIT Guwahati, who shows that there is no history of the rhino being a symbol of state building in the long history of Assamese civilizations and cultures. For 600 years, Assam was under the rule of the Ahoms. Ahoms are a very important political entity. There is an enormous amount of literature about the remaking of the riverscape, which Saikia has written about in his book, The Unquiet River. But the Ahoms also give us a legacy of fascinating books on elephants, just as there is the Matanga Leela in southern India, the Gajashastra, the various books of the Hasta Ayurveda. There is the book of Palakapya, which is about the upkeep of elephants. So elephants were very important, not only for warfare, but for about 4 to 5 months, large parts of the Brahmaputra and Barak valleys The water inundates vast parts of land, and there is no division really between the water and the land. You cannot get about on except on a boat. And of course, as the waters were shallow, you could, if you were rich enough, afford an elephant. In recent work, Gunel Sedilov, Founding an Empire, talks about how the British found it difficult to measure land when so much of it was underwater for so much of the year. So it's an area with a very limited amount of arable land. Much of the arable land, flooding is part of that cycle, and huge numbers of elephants were found in Assam. In the Mughal period, in Habib's Atlas, he has certain locations where he says 500 elephants were captured as tribute every year, even at the risk of exaggeration. It's an incredibly productive landscape. So how did the rhino become Assamese, not the elephant? One answer is, of course, obvious. The rhinoceros was exterminated in much of its range by the late 19th, early 20th century, partly for the horn, partly for the clearing of its grassland home, for the expansion of wet rice cultivation. And the few rhinos that were left in Assam were given strict protection. There was trade in rhino horn, but it was regulated. They slowly recovered. And by the 1930s, in Assamese writings, there's an Assamese cultural assertion, which has been studied by many scholars. They start arguing that the rhino is a symbol of our heritage and our culture. Rhino poaching was quite an important issue there. Very important officer in Northeast India, A.J.W. Milroy, was one of those who cracked down on the poachers in the area known as Kaziranga. And he wrote about how there were poachers who came in from the hills. Around this time, in the writings in Assamese and also in Milroy's writings, the poachers are identified with a very particular group who were classified then as tribals and who are a scheduled tribe today, the Bodos. In a sense, this is extremely unfair because all Bodos are not poachers, and by no stretch of imagination were or are all poachers Bodos. But the idea that a non-Assamese entity was menacing an animal that was the symbol of Assamese assertion, Assamese as a linguistic group, but Assamese also as a political community, dates to the 1930s. So by the 1970s and 80s, in this Assam versus New Delhi tussle, and this tussle for more powers for Assam, also for different ways of defining who was or was not Assamese, the rhino effectively was recruited or was commandeered, if you like, because we don't know what the rhinos thought. Nobody bothered to ask them, and we have no idea if they would have the time and energy to give opinions on such trifling questions that trouble us humans so much. But the rhino was a symbol of Assam. And just as aliens shouldn't come in and settle in Assam, the rhino should not leave its native soil for another state. So it's in the time of the president's rule that few rhinos are captured and taken to Dudhwa, where there are over 30 today. Assam earlier, not this year, but last year, 2019, parted with another very interesting animal, the wild buffalo, the Arna, and some wild buffaloes were taken from Assam, from reserves, to a reserve in Chhattisgarh, where they have been able to establish them in a new home. So there's a process of renaturing of these animals, where the same foresters, the former sport hunters turned protectionists, who helped to exterminate these animals, who saw it as a matter of great courage and bravery and masculinity to go out and shoot these animals, convert them into trophies, now shoot them with dart guns, move them, and regard their return as part of a remaking of a landscape which is incomplete without them. So these landscapes, the landscape of Assam in this case, is deeply politicized, and the rhino became Assamese. This has a very interesting subtext which abounds in irony. The Bodos in the 1980s and 90s went through a phase of militancy, and eventually there's a series of accords and an autonomous zone established. This autonomous zone included a very important park in Assam known as Manas, and Manas was on the shores of the Manas and Sankosh rivers, a very beautiful and epic and scenic area which has several endangered species, an old reserved forest, sanctuary, national park, tiger reserve, both on the Indian and the Bhutanese side. And the rhinos of Kaziranga were wiped out because of the value of their horn. And some rhinos were taken from other parts of Assam. And when a calf was born some years ago, it was given a Bodo name. And these rhinos were declared the pride of Bodo land. The rhino had become Bodo, or rather, the Bodo political entity had made the rhinos their own. What is it that transforms nature into an attribute of nationhood? At one level, we should not be so surprised. All nations claim that they are products of nature. The notion of the nation, a group of people who shares a glorious past, hopes to come together with a radiant future, is a very significant one in human history. The 20th century was one of the march of the nation state. The number of nations measured as nation states went up roughly fourfold between 1914 and, let us say, 2014. So the beginning of the Great War to a century later, number of nations goes from 50 to 200. Many of these nations celebrate their heritage, not only in terms of language, culture, faith, or dress, but also in terms of animals, birds, or plants. Sometimes it's ironical. These symbols are shared even though they are contested. What could be a better example than the fact that the Palestinian Authority, which has a precarious existence in the occupied territories, which have now been redesignated and are sought to be annexed by Israel, the Palestinian Authority, as its in its stamps, shows great prominence to a bird known as the hoopoe. It's understandable. The hoopoe has great significance in Islam. The hoopoe, when it opens its wings, has, it's like a scroll in black and white. And Orthodox and religious Muslims will tell you that it, if you look carefully, has the words Bismillah, which is so significant in the history of Islam, and particularly of that of its founder. But the hoopoe has another identity. It is the national bird of another people, the people of the state of Israel. So it's very interesting that nature, which can unify, can also divide. And this particular question of history, identity, and culture has different outcomes in different places. Not all of them are so sharply contested. One of the very interesting states in North India is that of Rajasthan. And Rajasthan has many regions. The two great regions are Mewar and Marwar. And there's a very famous saying in Western India, which says, Aunla Aunla Mewar, Babul Babul Marwar. If you cross over from the areas of Mewar, which is eastern Rajasthan, which are more well-watered, which have more forest, which include hill ranges, which have very little desert or semi-desert land. These areas have a tree called the Aunla, which has incidentally very bright, very beautiful yellow flowers. When you cross over from the area of the Aunla into the area of the Babul is a generic term for acacia. There are very many species of acacia, many native to India, some naturalized here, some brought in from Africa. And this particular transition from Aunla to Babul is supposed to be the transition from Mewar to Marwar. And these are areas with a very powerful local patriotism. The local patriotism was not only around deities or the Boli, Mewadi and Marwadi are Bolis. They're different kinds of language. I hesitate to use the word dialect because it has about it a somewhat pejorative connotation. But these trees and animals and birds and plants were as important. One major difference, of course, is that these are symbols that are contested. What better place to end than by going back to the animals we began with, the tiger and the lion. The lion, as you know, had a very extensive range in India over much of North, Central, and Western India. One of the places where over 50 to 60 lions were killed, you'd be surprised to know, in the late 1850s, after the crushing of the rising, the Gadar of Sattavan, or the Bagawat, or the Bidroh, also called the First Indian War of Independence. In 1857-58, Colonel Ackland Smith set out from Delhi in the morning and came back in the evening. He went on horseback and he hunted in this period, 1857-58, 55 lions within a day's horse ride of Delhi. Many must have been shot in the area that now comprises the state where my university is located, Haryana. Haryana in the 1820s, 30s to 50s records many instances of lions being hunted. And the hunting, the killing of the lion was seen as one of the civilizing missions of the East India Company Raj and later of British rule. My supervisor, Professor Tapan Rai Chaudhary, is no more with us. Had he been with us, he'd have been in his late 90s. He often liked to caution those of us who were interested in recording faunal history that we were making a grave mistake by taking our respect, regard, or affection for the great beasts of the forest and projecting it backward. He said that growing up in Eastern Bengal, in the early part of the 20th century, It was commonly believed, certainly by many of the literati, both traditional and new, that the wiping out of the Thug, the Pindari, was as great an accomplishment of the Raj as the destruction or the elimination of the tiger. So just as there were bandits in human form, the tiger was seen as a marauder of cattle. I go back to the lion. The name for the lion in Gujarati, one of the names, is Savaj. But Savaj can also mean the one that makes the goats bleat. So what is it that makes an animal that has for centuries been a hunter of cattle, of goats, of sheep, of buffaloes, of cows, of camels, which are so significant for animal husbandry and agriculture, also into a symbol of power, of fear, also a deity, also a creature that may command your respect. And in recent years, we come back to this very big question of whether there is a sharp edge to the boundary or a continuum. I referred to Mewar and Marwar. You're all aware that there is a great dilemma of conservation in a country of not just a billion people, but a country where over half the land area is now cultivated, which has one of the largest urban populations on earth, over 350, 400 million, and where economic transformation is bringing about epochal changes in the landscape. After all, the identity of a country with its history and its ecology could also be affirmed by the conquest of nature, the creation of great dams that will girdle the rivers, the building of enormous highways, the laying down of great railways, the inauguration of steel furnaces and other forms of modern industry, each of which requires fossil fuels or minerals extracted, if you like, from the bowels of the earth. These epochal changes may transform the landscape. They may or may not generate wealth that is adequate. They may or may not give material dignity to millions who lack it today. They may or may not bring about a more equal society. But along with these debates, there is another question. What happens with these epochal economic changes to the larger ecological landscape, the web of life, if you like, which girdles us? After all, a country is not only about the 1.3 billion people that live in it. M. Krishnan, the great writer, raconteur, photographer of India's wildlife, for over half a century, liked to argue that there is more to a country than its human-made monuments. The notion of a country is also about its rivers, its mountains, its lakes, its birds, its beasts. The law, the legend, the fable, after all, is not just about nature in the raw. It also celebrates the human relationships with nature. Krishnan liked to remark that India was unique, that there were over 21 mammals which are not found anywhere else on earth, including the animal I talked a lot about, the black buck, and others much more familiar to all of you, like the bear, the sloth bear. And Krishnan argued that you could not retain the identity of a country if you did not keep aside not 5, but perhaps 10% of its landscape in the state that nature gave it. This is a somewhat extreme view. One could argue there are other ways in which humans can cohabit with landscapes and add to it and improve it without destroying that web of life. How do we do it? It's a very difficult question. It's a question which we have to deal with in a democratic manner, in a participatory manner. This is easier said than done. It has to be done keeping in mind, however, another dilemma which existed in early religious texts in the epics and the fables, in lore, in oral lore, of how do you achieve a peace not just with people, a fraternity of the humans? How do you achieve a peace with nature? How does one try to live in amity with other species? And how do we live in amity with future generations? These are not easy questions to answer, and we grapple with them, as I said, living through epochal changes. But history is useful. History is useful not because it is a guide. It cannot be a guide. It cannot give us a silver bullet solution. We cannot understand what to do by knowing what happened in the 2nd century BCE, or 1,000 years ago, or 500 years ago, or even 50 years ago. But the past is important. Nature's pasts are important because nature has been transformed through human action. These actions have sometimes had unintended outcomes. And one of the positive ways to look at this is that this tapestry of life in India still retains enormous richness of faunal and floral diversity, that it has been possible to cohabit people with these birds, beasts, and all the other creatures some so small that they've probably not even been studied or named. And keeping that living tapestry intact is as much about how we engage with our pasts. If we can draw from it insights which inform us so that we have the wisdom, the care, the ability to try and achieve that peace with nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your informative and thought-provoking presentation. Now the session is open for discussion. I will read out the questions in the chat box. Before that, I have one question, sir. That is, your latest work, Nature and the Nation, is a collection of essays on environment. It touches upon a range of subjects. You have looked the human interaction with the natural world and relationship on Indian society. At different points in time, our notion of nature was different. Could you elaborate more on how this relationship works?
Of course. This is a fascinating question, but it calls for a whole different lecture. I think these relationships change over time. One very interesting way to illustrate it is remarkable work by Sabyasachi on the Simlipal Tiger Reserve, where he contrasts how the administrators of the reserve, people who have set up the tiger reserve, perceive the forest and keep counting it, measuring it, and studying it. And the more tigers there are, they believe they are successful because the number of tigers can only be high if there is adequate prey. And the prey will be in substantial number and diversity as long as the herbivory is able to get herbs, plants, forbs, grasses that will support it. So there's a web of life, and by protecting the predator, they're able to secure the entirety of the system. And Sabyasachi goes into the same place and looks at a very different kind of perception, particularly by the hill Kharyas who live more than 1 day away, 1 day's walk away from the main road. And they look at the forest divided into different into different ranges, not by the number of tigers, but by the quality and taste of honey. So the forest is a place where different parts of the forest are marked by madhu bhandars, or these giant honey hives. And they extract the honey. They do utilize the forest. But he argues that they do not do so in a manner destructive of the fabric of the forest. So without romanticizing, he's arguing there are different ways of perceiving nature. In one, the predator is the unifier because you look at the top. The other, it's the pollinator, which roams around and fertilizes, cross-pollinates the flowers and generates honey. So can we look at landscapes of habitation, which are shared, and not only landscapes of exclusivity, which are appropriated? This is just one instance. And I think the instances abound. And one can look, in our case, at a very rich history, simply because of the enormous diversity of forms of property, of forms of tenure, of forms of technology, of forms of settlement. This very diversity, which is often seen by people as vociferous, to me is an expression of the enormous topographical and ecological diversity of the landscape. Without romanticizing it, I think there is a lot to be done by learning from this in a creative and intelligent manner, bringing in modern methods, but learning from it. So this is a larger question, but I want to thank you. That's a very good way to start the discussions.
Thank you, sir. The one more question is, are there any historiographical shifts in environmental history? Could you please comment on this in connection with the theories on urbanization, human geography, etc.?
This is a very large area of work, and as you know, there is a question of which can be seen in terms of cities not being new entities. I live in Delhi, which has a 1,000-year history. There have been 7 cities of Delhi. My colleague with whom I'm now trying to do some work, Professor Harini Nagendra, works and lives in Bangalore, which is around 500 years old. And one of the features of both these cities is that they're in semi-arid zones. We tend to forget that the rainfall in Delhi is less than 60 centimeters a year, ditto to Bangalore. And the actual vegetation of these areas is semi-arid. These are areas where millets were grown, bajra, jowar in the north, ragi in the south. Or there'd be a single crop of wheat in the north. And there would be a lot of animal husbandry. And the kind of vegetation was xerophytic, very thorny bushes. You would see both these are extremely green cities over the last 100 years. One reason is a lot of water has been pumped out of the ground. There's a huge harnessing of groundwater. That has been the story of India's success. But be clear, the rate at which the groundwater is being pumped out is much greater than the rate at which it's being replenished. And there is a question of whether the new patterns of urban growth are cognizant of the limitations imposed by the regimes of precipitation and the need to recharge the aquifer. And both Bangalore and Delhi, much more Bangalore than Delhi, are marked by the destruction of the water bodies that were there where the land was, there were natural depressions where the soil was scooped out over centuries. And there were water bodies that was able to provide adequate drinking water. I'm not suggesting it could provide for industrial and other uses, not even agriculture adequately perhaps. So there are many theories of urbanization. What one of the larger questions is, when you create an industrial and service sector-based landscape of concrete and brick and stone, in what have been long-lived agricultural landscapes and agrarian landscape, and a pattern of city building which was able to, I will not say harmonize, but build on the insights of that agrarian landscape. So the tank builder was very important. Very interesting work by Nityanand Jayaraman from Chennai. And he shows that Chennai in the next 20 years will expand vastly into areas of the Porumbokkar, which are common lands, which include wetlands, brackish water lands, seawater lands, freshwater lands. And these are areas which sustained not only a range of occupations and livelihoods, such as fishing or trapping or grazing or resource gathering, also important for the recharge of water and a protection against floods, because in many semi-arid areas, there is a big variation in the rates of precipitation. So one large question is the new model of the city which has come up. Is it in consonance with the design which is friendly with nature? Can it be much more attentive to those designs? When we look at the phenomena of floods in cities as diverse as Guwahati, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Chennai, Delhi, Mumbai, I can expand that list. Is it because are these natural disasters? Or is the nature of design not drawing on the insights of history? So the way I pose it, it should be clear what I think. Abdul Saab, very good question. Was Indian freedom struggle carried out to regain the forest as much as to regain the land? Yes and no. You know, Gandhiji's Dandi March is very famous. And in the Dandi March, you were asked to go to the seashore and make salt. It's a kind of common property. The very act of making salt would be civil disobedience. It would result in penalties, but the maker of salt would neither surrender the salt nor give up the right to make salt. In the areas where there was no salt, Mahatma Gandhi asked people to violate the forest law. And in a fascinating paper by David Baker, A Dangerous Time, he shows that in the central provinces, the breaking of the forest law was led by men like Dwarka Prasad Mishra and Ravi Shankar Shukla, two chief ministers of central provinces, later Madhya Pradesh. But they wanted to do symbolic actions, go into the forest, chop a few trees and come out. For the Korkus and Bhils and Gonds and other Adivasi peoples, for them it was not a symbolic action. They wanted to take over the forest. They wanted to set up homesteads. They wanted to transform the forest into an Adivasi-dominated space. And I think that those conflicts, therefore, are playing out and have played out in independent India. So there were different notions of freedom, and there were different notions of the forest, and different notions of society. Bharat Mata with the lion. The Bharat Mata and the lion are coming together to overthrow the exploiter. But Bharat Mata with the lion is also because the mother, the country depicted in feminine form, is harnessing the masculine, the martial power of the lion. Lion is a symbol of the ferocity of a people that are aroused to fight against alien rule. And if you note carefully in the Bharat Mata portrayals, the lion stands a little to her left. And I think Sumati Ramaswamy, Crispini, and others have shown this dates to the early 20th century. Yes, I agree with your question. We should ask, why is it the downtrodden and marginalized bear the brunt of such development? Perhaps such development reproduces the larger, inequities of society rather than necessarily creating or setting out a new path. This is not true of all such attempts, but it's true of many of them. But we shouldn't be surprised. The same machinery that appropriated the forest is now appropriating it for the purposes of preservation. So I think it's a very, very serious question. And it should not be so, but it often is so. And so this peace with nature has to come along with peace among people. And peace, in order to be meaningful and stable, must be underpinned and accompanied by justice. So the peaceful attainment of justice, how do you create a just state by just means, a just society by just means? But a just society and just means, not only vis-a-vis people, but also nature, not just particular big animals. I'm referring to them because we're all familiar with them, but the fabric of nature. It's a serious question. Thank you. Thank you. They're very good questions.
The next question.
Yes.
Next question from Ali Dadich.
Yes.
Would you say that colonizing the animals and nature in general is a continuing trend in today's world, or there is a neglect of it entirely?
Ali, thank you. Nice to see you again. It's a very, very good question. Is the colonizing of animals and nature, is it continuing, or is it a mark of neglect? I don't know if colonizing is the right word, perhaps dominating. And perhaps one of the big debates, as you're well aware, and this is Sanskrit University, Kerala, the big debate of the 20th century until the 90s at least was capitalism and communism, which was more productive, which was more just. And each, of course, claimed that it was far better than the other. But one of the commonalities of both systems is that perhaps nature was seen, for the most part, as a sink of resources, as something to be conquered, tamed. And while that debate of capitalism, communism has faded away, those ideas are often held. Ask yourself how many statesmen or women who rule the great nations of the world, how many of those who steer the great economic entities of the world, the corporations, public or private, multinational or single state, regard these as serious questions. And perhaps one answer is that this idea of nature as a sink where you can keep extracting resources as if there's no tomorrow, not in terms of the depletion of the resources, but in terms of consequences, both intended and unintended, is a very important element of our lives. So we are living through, in the last 30 to 40 years, an enormous transformation of the economies of India and China. It's a long overdue transformation. These are countries which till 1700 had a very important role on the world stage. And one of the reasons they ceased to have a role is because they were economically left behind in the race, largely not due to their own fault. We can debate what was the role of colonization, direct, indirect, political, economic role. But one feature is that in this search for material dignity, in this search for the creation of a modern economy, is it being done at the cost of a livable, habitable, safe environment? I'm not even using the word sustainable. Livable, habitable, safe. It's a very important insight which is garnered because of a lot of the works of ecology, which is that many of these populations of a variety of species are important for keeping nature's systems in shape. One great transformation of the India, Pakistan, Bangladesh of the 21st century is that in the last 30 years, 90 to 97 or 95% of the vultures, the three major vultures, have vanished. They're not there. They're gone. They're gone because when the mother vulture lays an egg, the eggshell is so thin that the young does not hatch. The reason is there are certain chemical processes in the mother vulture's body, some enzymes, biochemical reactions. Those are just rescued. They rescue because of diclofenac, which is used, scientists tell us, by individual herd owners to inject the animals. And livestock keeping has done phenomenally well. The consumption of meat, milk, wool has done remarkably well. People have earned better. They're living better. People are drinking more milk. They're eating more butter and cheese. But this has come, this economic breakthrough has come at a great ecological cost. And the fact that the diclofenac is lodged in the body of the vultures and they are not breeding is a sign that the system, the natural human continuum, is breaking down. So of course it is being largely neglected. It's not even part of our consciousness. It's something out there. It's something which ought to be out here. And I do believe that drawing on these cultural memories and ideas, notions of resilience is important. We have to combine it with a deep science-based awareness of our own age. So thank you, Ali. That's a very good question. Sajeev?
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Sajiv TV. The scenario of human wildlife conflict in Kerala and several other places is one on the rise, and the compensation given now may collapse the administration. What lessons can we take from history in trying to address this situation?
It's a very interesting question. And I think one way to look at it is that you take a very large animal, which you are familiar with in Kerala, the elephant. There are over 400 people, not close to 500 people every year, killed by elephants in India, and about 100 elephants killed by people in India. Most elephants are killed by people protecting their crops. Most elephants are not killed for ivory. Much of the ivory is gone. Most of the tuskers have already been killed. There are some left, but they're a small number. And here I think that both the cultivator or the laborer and the elephant are both victims. They are both victims of a situation where each is simply trying to protect their livelihood or living, and each is trying to protect their kin or themselves. So beyond compensation, which should be given in a timely manner, and there have been suggestions. The Elephant Task Force gave suggestions for public hearings, including revenue, civil, forest authorities, to be held at the beginning of the sowing and the end of the harvest season, so that those monies are given on time. But much more than that, in areas where these conflicts are sharp, we need much more detailed idea of what are the local drivers of conflict. Are they changing human behaviors, forms of production? Are the animals changing the way they behave or forage or breed? And what are the ways in which we can diffuse and reduce these conflicts? There is a range of things that could be done. So the deeper insight is that we need to tackle this head on. And neither the animal which suffers loss of life or injury, nor the people who suffer loss of life or injury should have to deal with this alone. I refer to the latter particularly because it is these people or peoples who live with these animals. About 10 years ago, the estimate was 500,000 people were affected directly or indirectly by crop loss due to elephants. Another compendium, again compiled just over 15 years ago, estimated that if you get large carnivores, wolves and creatures from the wolf to the tiger or the bear, about a third of their diet came from domestic livestock. These are not sustainable situations. And even if they are sustainable, they're not just situations. They're neither fair to the animal, nor are they fair to the people. And my sense is that today a country such as India, states such as Kerala and others, have the intellectual capability, the administrative capability, the societal capability to deal with these issues. So I think it's a very good question, Sajeev, and thank you. It's something we're hopeful about, but also very concerned about.
Thank you, sir. Next question from Nandini Jana. Could you please elaborate on the endeavor by the makers of the nation when, after the independence, they picked up the lion symbol of Ashoka as the national symbol? What was the politics behind this?
I wish I knew. There needs to be much more work on it. There's a lot of work on Ashoka, and there's a lot of work on the lion. And some of it might surprise you. It's because of the decoding of the Brahmi script by James Prinsep that we got to learn much more about Ashoka than we knew before. In her work, Professor Nanjot Lahiri, the best biography of Ashoka, my distinguished colleague, has shown that there are memories of Ashoka before this. But by the early 20th century, Ashoka becomes particularly important to Jawaharlal Nehru. And I'm sure you're aware that this is because Ashoka not only became a Buddhist, but gave up war as an instrument of policy and tried to create a society based on Dhamma. And one of the elements of Dhamma for Ashoka is plural a plural society where different forms of faith, even as atheists, have freedom. And one dimension of this was his injunctions against hunting, killing, his very early attempts to protect certain animals. There's work which shows that the first attempt to protect the rhino, remember the rhino, Kadaga, was by Ashoka. There's an animal found in the Ganga which he refers to, which may be the dolphin. It may be the Gangetic dolphin, we're not sure. The lion symbol, well, as you are well aware, Mahatma Gandhi wanted it to be the charkha. But the Congress opted for the lion symbol. I think an empire of the ancients was seen India not only as a modern nation, but India as having roots in the past. And the lion capital being picked was that. But the lion had other meanings as well. If you read the works of Savarkar, a very major critic of Mahatma Gandhi and of Jawaharlal Nehru, Savarkar felt that the lion was a symbol of the Hindu Padpachai. And he wanted the lion to be the national animal, not the cow. Of course, the lion became the national animal only in 69, not when India became independent. But as a national symbol, it was probably seen as a unifying symbol. And Ashoka's Dhamma, Ashoka's pluralism, Ashoka's abjuring war as an instrument of policy, while he retained his army, by the way, was probably very attractive to a movement based on non-violence. Yours is a good question, and I think there is more work needing to be done. There's a volume edited by Professor Himanshu Ray, which looks a lot at Ashokan symbolism.
Sir, next from Matthew Varghese. This is a question out of sheer curiosity. Could you give your thoughts on how much of the mythical presence of Ashwa corroborated by the faunal archaeological evidence for a parallel presence in numbers? I was wondering how far are the broader Icans that includes the non-horse Icans as well as the extinct varieties like foothill variants of Shivalik also contributed to the prevalence, not forgetting the horse trading history.
You know, I wish I knew the answer to this. I was thinking there is a book being under preparation right now by Achyutan and others from the Institute of Science. And there's a very fine popular book called Indica by Lal, Pranay Lal. That might be useful. I don't know. My impression was these horse varieties you are referring to are older varieties which existed in geological time. And the horse that we see today, whatever the variants, is the same equus genus and species. But I'll come back and look at it and ask colleagues who know more about the archaeology, Matthew. That's a very good question, but I don't know. Horse trading has a very long history, as you know. Trotman's other work is about how, for the last 2,500 years, till the 1830s and 40s, India was a great importer of horses. The horses came from Central West Asia, both by the sea route and the land route. And they continue to come right to the 1830s and 40s, from as early as the 5th, 6th century BC or little later. So one reason is India has not been able to breed the quality of horse that they wanted. There were some quality horses, such as the Kathi or the Marwadi horse, some of the various Tangal and other ponies. I have a student now working, Aritri Chakrabarti, on, among other things, horses in Bengal. But the best horses used by armies and rulers were traditionally imported.
Next, Manoj Kumar have a question. Sir, how far the Forest Act do justice to environmental justice?
Well, the Forest Acts were enacted in the British era. There is a lot of work on the 1878 Act, which provides the basic scaffolding. And the 1878 Act criminalized a lot of forest-dependent activities. It created different categories of government forests, reserved forests being those where rights were recorded and settled. And the takeover of the forest by the 1900s, almost 600,000 square kilometers, was one of the great administrative accomplishments of the British Empire. But as has been argued by the late Williams, Michael Williams. It left a festering sore on the body politic of India, of the herders, shifting cultivators, artisans, several peoples who depended on the forest. So I think the forest acts were predicated on a very different idea of state power. And very few people would today, I mean, most scholars who study the subject and several people from large movements who questioned it would see these as deeply unjust. And the Forest Rights Act of 2006 was a very small step to justice because it provided for the recognition of individual rights to homestead, very small areas of land, and to the legal protection of community rights. There are barely 8 to 10% of the latter which has been done. Ali, does colonizing? Yes, nationalism, nations do annex nature, and one should ask whether the act of preservation is an act of securing nature for its own sake, or is it destroying nature to put it in service of the nation state? This doesn't have one answer, there can be many. Deepna Kuttiyil has a very good question. Methodological challenges of integrating animal behavior and action into history. And the references to Sangam literature and the behavior of animals. I know very little of Sangam literature because my Tamil is nowhere near good enough. But from what little I have read, particularly works of the late A.K. Rangarajan and the very, probably the finest, one of the finest scholars of Southern India and of Indian history today, A.R. Venkatachalapathy. There is a deep sense in Sangam literature of different notion of landscape, very different from the pharmacopoeias I spoke about. The 5 landscapes from the coastal to the mountain, and the descriptions of mood, of place, of time, animals as well as birds are absolutely significant in it. And it's a very important living heritage, not only of Tamil speakers and Tamil people, but of humanity at large. The integration of animal behavior and actions into history is also a different form. Do animals have history? Do animals have a sense of history? Is history something only made by humans? And even if they're not conscious that they're making history, do animals have a role in history? I'd argue they do. After all, there's a very interesting book on the Barents Sea by Dukin, and she argues that this sea between Alaska and Russia has got a creature called the humpback whale. You know, it's very important because the longest lived mammal lives 250 years. A humpback whale born 250 years ago has lived through huge cataclysmic changes in history. At a certain stage in the 19th century, whalers got harpoons, which were powered. A harpoon could go and hit the whale. But after some time, the whales learned how to avoid these ships. They gave some sort of an alarm and they took deep dives. So animals are not inanimate beings. They change their behaviors. And the behaviors of animals, even those in the wild, supposedly wild, is different in different phases. Because in some cases, particularly with mammals, over generations, their behaviors adapted to the humans around them. One of the best instances of this, I was looking at the names of the 112 people, I think around 80, 70, are in southern India. We're all familiar with monkeys. The monkey you see around you is the bonnet macaque. The bonnet macaque doesn't live in forests. I mean, it does. But last generations of bonnet macaques for hundreds of years have lived in and around human settlements. They live in towns, they live in cities, they live in villages. And over time, their behavior has also evolved and adapted. So this is a very important question. In fact, it's one of the frontier areas of history as a discipline. And it's also a frontier areas of new studies of animal behavior, which look at a continuum between animals and humans. These could be domestic animals, these could be wild animals. If you're interested, I will recommend for you a book called Animal Intimacies by Radhika Govindarajan, a remarkable study of monkeys, bears, leopards, and cows in Uttarakhand. And one of the things you realize is for the people living in those places, mostly cultivators and herders, there's no gap between the animal and human world. They have all sorts of explanations, which we may or may not agree with. But there is a range of ways in which there are both accommodations and avoidances. There are also sharp conflicts. So, of course, the animals have had a very important role in our history, and we in theirs. And who makes history, how is it made, should include animals. And definitely, I would argue they are actants and actors. Whether they are actors with a sense of agency, subject for another discussion. Adolika Sutradhar has asked some light on the politics that go behind making an animal or labeling an animal as a wild beast, labeling an animal as a wild beast to be killed. Okay. And the animal which is worshipped as a vahana, that is what you're asking, and you have referred to the female deity. And the vahana itself helps to slay another entity, in this case, a malign one. Just read what you have written. I'm fascinated. Yesterday, we had a marvelous talk in our university by Professor Anu Jalai spoke about the traveling monk and the tiger. And one of the questions which did come up, which I want to share with you, is the tiger or the lion. By the way, Durga rides the lion, Kali rides the tiger. You are familiar with Ayyappa and the tiger. The divine or blessed entity who rides this large, ferocious, potentially human-killing beast or animal is not taming the animal. They have not rendered it an animal which you or I can ride. They have not transformed it into an animal which another person can go near. In fact, it is the power of the Devi that she can ride the lion. Even the lion recognizes her power. So is the lion sacred or is she sacred? Does her sacredness not in part derive from the ability to channel the ferocity of the lion to devotion to her and her blessings to the devotee? So I am hesitant. Valmiki Thapar has written about India, the land where the tiger was worshipped as a vehicle of Durga. I'm not sure. I think Durga was worshipped for bringing the tiger in control, for reining it in. And this is absolutely the case. The lion or the tiger becomes a part of that divine entity in its struggle against other entities which are malign or evil. Let me give an instance. See, rather than see it as good evil, there is in southern India a term called Pishach. It's supposed to be an entity which doesn't have feet and comes in, so it does nasty things in the dark. There are certain people who can tame the Pishach, which are magic spell. So there are these shades of grey, and it is the ability to calm either through fear or by inspiring reverence this enormous beast that is a mark of divinity. So there are different etymologies, different histories of these different deities. It's very difficult to go into it here, but I think it's not a coincidence that there is a second very interesting kind of variant. This has been studied by Dr. Vidya Atreya and some anthropologists with her. There are these hero stones. These are there in Western India. They're also there in Southern India. This is a spot where a man fought and killed a leopard, or a leopard attacked and killed a man. So it commemorates it, not as a battle, but out of respect. The bravery or the hero stone of the person who defended the flock or a child against this animal. But when the animal has killed the person also, it is respected. So there are these Vagadevas. Those are worship of the animal. I'm not sure the Vahana is worship. We should be careful. All Vahanas are not objects of worship. Nandi, the bull, is an object of worship. I don't know if the lion and the tiger are objects of worship. Respect, yes, but the respect is out of fear. Ali, you're asking another question. No, but we've gone through that. So, Miss Nazareth, something about the attendance. Abhinav, what role do forests play in the lives of tribals, and what can we borrow from them? very difficult for one person to borrow from another, but I think it is broadly true to say that of all the communities that are there in the vast breadth of India, the environmental footprints of the Adivasi, the scheduled tribe communities, is probably the least. At the same time, the lands that they live in have become very important for the larger process of economic transformation, particularly the minerals, also the land, sometimes the waters, often the forests. While borrowing from their ideas, it is also important to recognize their right to live a life of material dignity and their rights to land and the forests. While that will not go a very long way, it will give them a footing on the basis of which they can negotiate a much better way of engaging with the wider society. And in that process, one of the very important elements one can learn from them is not so much their ideas, but practices. There may well be a range of practices of keeping landscapes and waterscapes habitable, livable, and productive. I'm not even using the word sustainable, I'm using more easier words, where their ecological integrity is maintained. And there may be a lot to learn. There may also have to be correctives. So some of the kinds of tribal hunts in eastern India may not be quite a wise uh, uh, practice in today's world, but a process of dialogue rather than simply diktat may be better. Nishant. A lot of political ecology is on a few iconic species. What are the relationships in political ecology and ecology? Disciplines were similar in the 30s. In the 70s, ecology gained experimental output. It focuses on variable individuals. How has political ecology changed? It's too large a question. I'm just a storytelling historian. I'm not a theoretician. I really don't know. My sense is the stories are more important. There are stories with varying outcomes. And these are very valuable disciplines like political ecology. They give us deep insight into the relations of political power, inequities in societies, their environmental consequences or dimensions. But beyond the point, I think that while drawing on the disciplines of the natural sciences, one needs the disciplines of the human sciences. The disciplines of the natural sciences, for the most part, looked at ecology abstracted from human society. Many scholars sought a land or water space where there were no humans. Such spaces hardly exist. The converse is true. Many of the human sciences studied humanity, our aspirations, goals, contentions, conflicts, regarding nature simply as backdrop, not treating it as a subject, except as metaphor, as literature, or as something to be fought about. Think of all the water wars and land wars that have marked history. But a different kind of awareness, not just as nature's artifact, not just as nature as aesthetic, but nature as part of a tapestry of life with which we are bound up inextricably, from which we both stand apart and we are part of. It's a dialectical and complex relationship. That is very critical. So I would argue there is a new kind of ecology, a new kind of sociology, a new sociological historical approach, and a new ecological biotic approach, which is required. And we need to be in dialogue with each other. There is much we need to learn about elephant behavior and ecology. We also need to learn about differing human aspirations, dilemmas, challenges, and conflicts. And unless that tapestry of that living landscape includes the humanistic dimension as well as the ecologic dimension, we will find it difficult to make sense of the world we are living in, not only in terms of the past, but also in terms of the future. After all, if we do not comprehend nature's past in a meaningful way, then we will not be prepared for our own future and nature's futures in a meaningful way. Can I hand over to the chair? So,
Do you want? Yeah. Okay.
we'll take
Legend.
one or two more questions and then I think.
Yes. Yes. Legend, are you there, or do you want me to read? This is from Nishant.
Yes.
Hi, Mahesh. Considering that a lot of discussion is focused on political ecology of a few iconic species, I would request your opinions on the relationships in political ecology and ecology. These disciplines were quite similar in the 1930s. that is interactions of X and Y and Z. But from 1970s onwards, ecology gained a lot of experimental outlook that explained variable abundance and distribution. Ecology now tries to focus on populations of variable individuals. How has political ecology changed? Thank you.
Yeah, so I did respond briefly, and I think we are not conducting experiments. The whole of this is a vast experiment in which we are taking part in somewhat unequal role. Some are bit players, some have the best dialogues. And I think a more historically orientated view, both of the sciences and humanistic sciences, will enable us to walk on two legs. We need both. They will not be in unison, they may often be contending. But it's good to have contending schools of thought, and through the contentions, better synthesis emerge. And then we go through fresh contentions and even better synthesis emerge, hopefully. So I see a very rich body of work emerging from those who are animated by these questions and are willing to look at the past, the present, the future. As a student of history, of course, I would argue one should look at the past. It gives a lot of clues and insights into the future as much as the present. Thank you.
The next question is from Leela. Tribal education and role playing by KISS in Orissa. Your opinion, please.
I'm afraid, Leela, I don't know very much about this organization, so you'll have to educate us. But of course, different pedagogical approaches are vital. These are not issues to be left over to the state. These are not issues to leave to a few people. They are issues that affect every citizen. And groups such as the scheduled tribes or Adivasis in mainland India would be among those. So all such efforts are very significant, but the specifics of this one, I'm afraid, we will perhaps be in touch and you can educate me and guide me better to it. Thank you.
That has been the last question for this session. So I think we've come to the end of the session. The moderator is not in the session because his call dropped, so I'm taking over from him. Yeah, I invite Abdul Rahman Kari to propose a vote of thanks for the session.
Thank you, Miss. We are going to conclude today's session here. It is an immense pleasure for me to express our gratitude to Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan. The entire session was indeed wonderful and insightful. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation to Lijin. He very well moderated the session. Thanks to all the people who made the session activate, either directly or indirectly, to make the meeting successful. Once again, thank you so much, sir. You took the time out of your busy schedule to address our small group. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir, for spending
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. My privilege and pleasure and a great honor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you all for participating. Bye.